So, hello everybody again, and well, thank you for being here and attending, and for all those who are on the internet sphere and can follow this conversation that is about to begin. Today, with me, I have the pleasure to have Janet Blatter, who's a PhD, has a PhD from McGill in Integrated Studies from the Faculty of Education with a focus on cognitive science. And her specialization is visual design based problem solving, visual spatial and temporal reasoning, and collaborative design. And more specifically, her research focuses on film animation because Janet, you see film animation as being a very crucial area where one can study the temporal and spatial aspects, especially in the design process and this problem solving.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And also, you're a scholar in residence in the National Film Board of Canada, and your publications and presentations at numerous film and interdisciplinary conferences. They push between the boundaries between the ideal, neat theoretical models and the messy world of real-world animation design. And I think this, if I can call it contradiction, although we have to come up with a better word when we're talking about these two maybe opposite but friendly concepts or synergetic concepts. And I know you look into the areas of cognition and of here, of course, we're contrasting the perfect models of the theorists versus the messy world of the practice. But I find parallels between that and our lives in general. It's a very broad concept. It applies, I think, to animation, the way I do animation, but also the things that I depict, but also, and here I think is my specialization or niche that I'm trying to explore, which is the way we make film animation and the way we represent this physical, atmospheric, even component of the city, which machines probably cannot always grasp by themselves. We have an agency there, and I think we still do. So that paradigm of ideations and practice applies in my practice, and I think in what I'm looking for, and this is the reason why I really wanted to talk to you and have this conversation here. We met in Lisbon in 2019 in the Society for Animation conference, and well, because of the pandemic, we didn't have the chance to talk, and I think this is a very good opportunity to have some exchange. I know I'm in the spotlight because it's my spotlight event, but I want to shed some light also, throw it at you, and try to get some of your experience in this matter, since you've spent decades doing this research.
So the thing about cognition is that for me, it's not for a number of the cognitive scientists, it's not a left brain, right brain thing. It's not something that if you are creative, it's, the right brain. And if you're logical, you're using your left brain. It's the kinds of things that you do. And just looking at your presentation, you'll go from your gut when you can, but you'll also stop going from your gut when you have a problem. Problem solving and problem finding is critical in what you're doing. And when you go into that mode, there is a logic behind it. You can almost sense it. But the other thing is that the amount of time that it takes for you to draw something will differ when you have a problem or when you're just doing something that's simple for you. So I look at that. That's where I go into more closely the nature of time and what does time mean. There was a movie called The Core. It's not an animated film, but there was a character in it who was kind of positioning himself against the scientist at the time. He was just a young geek. And the scientist was saying, why should I have you involved in this at all? I speak like 12 languages. What do you speak? And he said, I only speak one language. It's 0 and 1. I couldn't think as slow as you, even if I tried. My experience with animators is that they think at a speed that is faster than most of us. Oh, okay. I'll shout. So there is a definite temporality that you have to deal with in terms of the frames, in terms of what the viewer is going to see. There is another temporality that you have to deal with in terms of the character's logic. If you're telling a narrative, any kind of narrative situation, whether it's people or whether it's trees, if there is a story behind it, is what is the temporality of this movement versus this. And then there is the third, is what the viewer is going to be seeing, how you want to depict that. So you as the animator, the vision of the perception of the viewer and the logic, in a way, the motivation in this fictive world, you have to think about time in those three areas. And that's why I think that animation is probably one of the most difficult things to do.
Yes, because you somehow, you almost dissect time, or you extend it, and it's not the time that one spends making these frames or even shooting them is not synchronous with the other end of where that animation will go.
Exactly. That's the point.
Which is the challenge and the beauty at the same time.
That's right. It's the difficulty, and that's where the splendor comes from. That's where it is. And you have to have that kind of, I don't want to say mental acuity or that flexibility to be able to do that. That's not, scientists do that also. When they are at creating something, they are at the same, that kind of thinking is not different depending on your field, except for the nature that you have to think about it in terms of a fictive world, in terms of what is that world that's out there that you're presenting.
And there's the time that is very valuable, and it's not really visible.
That's right.
Time is not maybe that a visible quality, but meaning that it's not something that people can appreciate or can perceive from the outside when seeing into the world of the animator, and especially and generally the artist. That the time we need to spend away from practicing, executing.
Right.
I remember you telling me once about the valuable time, or the conceptual, the time for conceiving things, and how NFB animators would go back. And here I'm bringing the issue of materiality in the paper.
That's right.
How they may even start conceiving on a pad,
Paper.
On a digital device.
Oh, right.
But then go back to paper because that's a time that they need, and a space maybe that they need to.
There hasn't been
neurologically. I'm not sure.
There hasn't been too many studies on that. I mean, there were some studies on what paper affords, as the term is, that it gives you a kind of a feedback, not just visual but haptic. The pressure, the texture of a paper gives you a kind of a feedback that working on a tablet does not. So it's not just a perceptual thing. There are different things that go into your thinking when you're using paper. And my experience is that even the most digitally expert in most of the studios that I've actually done studies in, they'll start out by saying, we don't use paper, we don't have any paper around. And then they'll pause and they'll say, except when we have a problem. Mm-hmm. So these are really commercial and very, very expert animators, but they'll go to paper.
And this is still happening now,
yes,
because
this is happening now.
There's a lot of, well, I've read papers and research papers, they date to 2010, 2012, right. And you right. would say, well, yeah, but technology at that time was not as advanced and it wasn't so intuitive, and now people just use pads intuitively and it's so seamless. I'm not, of course, of the newer generation, so I'm not sure if it's a generational thing, but as far as making animation by hand, there is that aspect of, I say it in simple terms, fun.
Yes.
Which I was having here. Only the fact that I was moving from one table to the other and going and clicking on the computer a bit, but the fact that I was in tune with the outside environment, that I think was something that I was willing to do for a much longer time.
Right. That's a very important element, having fun, especially in the beginning of something. It's a very important element because that's where you're thinking, there is no box yet. You haven't created the box. So you're thinking, to say that you're thinking out of the box is really a misnomer when you're doing that kind of creativity, that kind of play. That's what it goes back to. It's the notion of play. And all of the work that I've read on design, they point out that the original stages in the entire process, the longest will take place in the earliest stage because it's the lowest risk. Mm. So having fun and just playing with ideas is what's going to create this enormous multi-million or billion-dollar production or something that's very close to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. And I mean, I quoted before, people who work with me know this, and from conferences, because I wanted to base my research on existing architectural research. And there's this scholar, Juhani Palasma from Helsinki, who has said the same thing about architecture, about the conceptual stage being a place in which architects still prefer to sketch. And I think the low risk factor has to do with that very coveted freedom.
But it's a very interesting thing because when you are in that original stage, you are still in control. As you get more and more of the animation being at a higher level, where you are now in the, the production stage and then the post-production stage, the product that you are doing, the film that you're doing, takes over. And you have to, in the beginning, your early sketches work for you. And then you get to a certain point where you are working for it. You no mm-hmm. longer are the focus of it. It's the work itself, because it has to survive without you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The amount of technology comes with all these parameters, pre-designed by others as to what one can or cannot do. And of course, we play with those. And of course, when we draw and we cut and we do things with our hand, we have many limitations. And again, the limitations are what, there's the beauty in that, because there's the economy of making things tell more than they would. But at the same time, as you said, I think the lines of the box are a little bit more dashed.
That's right.
In that stage, whereas towards the end, it's very specific, and you have to play with those specific parameters. You can come up with some ideas and make alterations, but as you said, it's the percentage of movement, I guess, is very limited.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And if you're working on something that's on a commercial or even an independent level, you have X amount of dollars and X amount of time. So it's not, there was this saying, if you give, this was before computers, if you give 100 monkeys 100 years, they'll come out with a Shakespearean, product. You have these resources, but they're limited. You don't have endless time to work on something. You don't have endless amount of money. So you have to know how to position the entire project in such a way where you have it's called a least commitment mode in the beginning, where you can play and do whatever because you're not that committed. The expense hasn't gone in there. So.
And would you think that the viewer senses that?
The viewer doesn't see that. The viewer sees the end product. The viewer doesn't see how many years was spent in the making of this film. When they say the making of this film, it starts before you pick up. Sometimes it starts before you pick up the pencil. It started years ago, possibly. It started when you were just finishing off your previous project. It could take years to develop something conceptually before you start working on it. Once you start working on it, you still have a give and take between your style and your composition and what you are actually putting down and the story. It's still a give and take, but as you get further along on the process, there's less of a give and take because you are fixed. You're fixed to, you have a commitment.
I was wondering whether the viewer senses any of the fun or any of the, the spontaneity. I know the word is now maybe misunderstood because there may be a level of spontaneity in any medium that we use, or that sense of, plainly the touch. When I do something with charcoal and I leave my fingerprints, and that of course has some kind of aesthetic but also some sensorial quality that Paul Wells, I believe, animator scholar, has written something about the indexality or the index, and how people can recognize sometimes ordinary objects. That's a different story, of course, when you have ordinary objects being in stop motion animation versus a drawn line. But then even there, you may see the drawn line and recognize it as such, that's a drawn line.
Yeah. So I think if you are an animator or a filmmaker, and if the final animation is on paper and you could see the texture and you can see the line itself, I think viewers will relate to what they're seeing on a deeper level. So I know it seems contradictory that if you are an expert, you're not seeing the film the way most other people see it. But I think other people can pick up on that if that's part of what you want to show.
That's what people have confessed over and over in some of the films that have shown them. They have recognized that aspect, and they find it, I don't know, I would say it captures their interest.
It's kind of like watching, it's like kind of like seeing, like just your your talk, your demonstration over here. It's like watching a magician reveal the secrets to you.
I felt like a magician at some point. It's true. Because the pauses and all these there was I had the sense that I was hiding something from other people, that I was going to reveal something, that I was going to surprise them, pretending that I don't know. But it's true that I did not know.
But that's but we don't know. There's nobody who, I mean, that's one of these contradictions that I'm struck with, is how you are very humble about what you're doing and saying, I don't know where this is going. But you do it anyway. You have that strength to do it anyway, not to give up.
Yes, and you know how there's that saying that if you love your medium or your art, you're like the violin player who has to have his violin under the pillow and sleep with it all the time. And I think that's one of my challenges, that maybe because I do a lot of interdisciplinary work.
Well, good luck sleeping with the computer.
Exactly, or the light table. Yeah. Or sleeping on the light table. But all this to say that the commitment, or the taking charge of these projects, because animation is so labor intensive, and there's a commitment beyond the sketch. So yes, a sketch is something that you do for the moment, but when you decide to start cutting things, placing them, organizing them in a story, and the execution itself, as people probably got an idea, which I did in the most rough way possible. But if I was to be a bit more meticulous about it, it's a big deal. So it takes that discipline to persist, and I say discipline with courage. But they're not contradictions. I think it's the same kind of, like, to have the courage to be disciplined.
That's right. But the other thing that I was thinking about, and this goes to your animation and your history from architecture, what did your background in architecture, do you think, gave you that benefits you as an animator?
Yeah, that's very a large part of who I am and what I do. And well, at a very first level is the appreciation of the built environment and the understanding of how architecture affects the way we live, the meanings that we find in our lives every day, the quality of life, and you can even go further and say the senses that we experience in every city is different, and sometimes we don't even have words to explain what is different about this city, and we do try to express, but it's never easy to express. I think it's almost impossible to express exactly what it is about a certain place or what it is about a certain city. So these are all things that I had in mind as an architect all the time. And architecture as a study has been a very disciplining or very detail-oriented work that went against the grain of my personality at the beginning. I think I had to become more disciplined and detail-oriented in some aspects. I'm not saying that I'm not detail-oriented in everything, but I think in some aspects that definitely helped. And the problem solving that you mentioned before is something that most people who finish architecture are drilled into novel problems all the time, new parameters, new problems, new solutions all the time. There is a tendency to think you're going to reinvent the wheel all the time, which I don't agree with, or the sake of doing something because it was never done before, which I'm also skeptical about.
Yeah, these two extremes.
Yeah. Both architecture, most people might not see that as evident, but architecture is temporal, not as designing maybe, but itself as object and as experience. And we live we live in the buildings, we experiencing them, we move in the buildings in different ways, different speeds, there's so much that the linear technical drawing cannot express. Mm-hmm. And I think one of my frustrations was that distance between this type of architectural drawing and the outcome, mm-hmm. and also the limitations of the requirements of building, which alter the pure ideas that one can have. When I say pure ideas, I mean pure ideas of about that. I think animation allowed me eventually to express stories about architecture, that element that I wasn't able to, and maybe animation is a medium par excellence to express mm-hmm. animation in the end, that may be incorporated, and I think it does already in architecture schools. Film has been employed mm-hmm. More and more, and yeah, but I think going to animation for me was also a step towards a more innocent place where I can be more free to think about spaces that don't have the constraints of technicalities, but try to somehow talk about the essence of place as a human experience.
So your work, it just dawned on me while you were talking. It just hit me how your work and goes into this group of work where the animator is actually a philosopher, and coming out with philosophical definitions, and I'm using the term definition very broadly, on essential concepts that people are still trying to grapple with. Time is one of them. We don't know what time is definitively, either from a scientific point of view or a perceptual point of view. It's a very, very ambiguous term that we all seem to know what it is, but there isn't one overarching, this is what time is, either in terms of temporal duration or temporal sequencing. Can we think about time without an object being there, for example? All of those issues that I'm playing around with, as a scientist, I'm realizing that animation can actually help you question those or inspire questioning the essence of what temporality really means. Mm. So thank you for making my life more difficult. That's
my job. It's mutual. Yeah. And time and and I think also the perception of time as something that has taken has worn a surface, has or has can be read in the things that we animate or in the cities that we live in. What we call patina of time, but it could be also just the consciousness of past life and past people, and that's also a time, which I think in the handmade medium somehow it evokes it in a certain way, because there's that mortality of the physical things that we use, or if not mortality, I would call it better, the decay.
You could decide to either emphasize that in an animation or extinguish that in an animation, and you are actually exposing it and bringing that out. That's so. You use the computer, you're using Dragon. How do you view where we're heading, like with AI?
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought how that would impact you as an animator?
Yeah, I somehow avoid the whole discourse because and you might scold me for this, but I'm resistant to this type of, let's say, progress, but maybe that's just out of fear, or just of what I value, or what I choose. I think technology is something that opens possibilities, and every time I see a possibility that can enhance what I already do, of course, it's something that I want to try, but at the same time, I don't think it should be an inevitability that technology, for example, that the technology is some kind of being that has a life in its own, and it's just going, and we have to follow it. Somehow we must have some kind of control over that technology, and having technology taking over may add all kinds of conveniences in our lives. We can have a very highly technological environment where life is easier, but I'm always thinking whether whether it's best to have an easier life. I'm not even sure if that's something that I want. Because usually what is convenient is not always meaningful to me.
Right.
And these struggles, or this messiness that you were referring before, or these inconvenient situations that allow for all kinds of spontaneous but also hazardous or unpredictable situations that the city can offer. That's something that I want to live with, and as I want to live with all the risks, or the open-ended. You said low risk, but I mean the realm of possibilities of these handmade techniques, which of course, AI can do miracles, but it's not really when I say miracles in terms of executing hyper-realistic maybe animation, or simulating realities that we can live, but in the end, I'm not sure if that's something that we want, or if it's something that I'm willing still to abandon. And I think that's why I called this talk "While the City Still Breathes,"
Right.
because I'm almost afraid that it's not going to be breathing, and that's
it also dawns on me, looking at your work, there's something that you're learning from actually doing all of this. I mean, yes, you could feed this into, well, maybe it will be Chat GPT 5, not 4, as we have. But maybe Chat GPT 5 will have the animation where, you'll put in your code and out will churn the animation. When you are doing your work, you're learning something. It gets passed forward to your next animation. I don't know whether that's going to happen if you can just code a computer to come out with something and then just give it, to the producer will have it done, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it is the best thing on the planet, the idea is you're not going to be learning. There is something about that play in the beginning, and the problems that you have to find and the problems that you have to solve, which is encouraging you to do better on the next one. Even if the first one was actually brilliant, the better is a very internal, it's an internal feeling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's cumulative.
Yeah.
And it's something that it's as cumulative as the traces on, I try to make the parallel between the physicality or the humanity of making things by hand, and I know it's not completely handmade. There's a hybrid component. There's a technological or digital component, which is the hybridity. But I'm constantly seeing, just as in the early 20th century, cinema was seen to be an ideal medium to express the modern city. Well, the same way animation is an ideal medium, I guess, to express not only the city but that tactile aspect of the city. And I know that when I say handmade animation, it's not exclusively handmade. There's an important handmade component, and I'm looking into ways into which this handmade component can make us appreciate perhaps the built environment, the city, in a way that CGI, or other very evolved technologies miss. I guess they can complement each other. I mean, every medium or technology has its place. But I think with the advent of some software that has facilitated those handmade techniques, I think they're very relevant still, and I'm looking into these ways of communicating that tactility, or that human aspect, or those aspects of the city that are more that have to do with the lived experience.
So that leads me to another question on how do you understand the physical object versus the abstract in your work?
Yeah, again, another of those seeming contradictions. Mm-hmm. It's even though there is a certain reality or certain the tactility and the real objects that I use are more real, if I'm allowed to say that, than the virtual reality, or at least they're not virtual, they're real. There is also the possibility of abstraction. So the reality refers to the material, or that indexical viewing or understanding of these objects. But then at the same time, because there's that open box, as you said before, I think they tell us more than what they are. They don't try to be something specific. They have that, they're abstract enough in their own way to allow for our imagination to perceive a greater breadth of area of meaning.
So that goes into the idea of abstraction itself. I mean, starting when we're very young, we begin to have this notion of pareidolia, where we can look at an electric outlet and see a face in it. We can find faces in the most abstract situations. We can see faces. The moon has a face.
Mm-hmm.
Children who are very young can watch cartoons that are very abstract. I'm not talking about the 3D cartoons that they can see now, but just the outline of two dots and and a curve, and that idea of this abstraction is part of, I think, of what all animation has. Even if it's 3D, there is something about, yes, when you're watching The Lion King, I was watching it with my husband, and he insisted that it was live action, that it wasn't. He didn't figure it out. And certainly when you're watching nowadays, if you're watching any action movie, a good percentage of it is animation.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of abstraction itself, I don't see it necessarily being extinguished because we can have more and more tools in making something that's abstract look realistic. I think there is something about thinking with abstract objects which is so embedded in us that I honestly don't believe that that's going to be extinguished. What do you think? Do you think we're going to be doing away with that, or?
No, I don't think so. It's just that the handmade materials and their abstraction deal with that contradiction between the perception of the real and also the openness of imagining things that somehow the hand drawn or the hand cut it's a statement in itself, and it tells you that there's definitely something beyond it.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's indexed to something else, but sometimes when I watch an abstract film, or when I'm focusing just on the independent animation that's entirely abstract, I begin to invent a kind of a story in my head, not a hero kind of story, but just a kind of a narrative for me to articulate what I'm seeing. So when I watch, for example, Norman McLaren's works, especially Be Gone, Dull Care, I don't know if you're familiar with that one, the imagery was so hypnotic, and I just kept watching how things were moving, and I was saying to myself, so this moves here, this moves here, this moves here, this moves here. So I was kind of inventing a narrative to it. And I just wonder whether you as an animator ever do that, where you can actually do something that's abstract, but you see it almost as a narrative. I'm putting this here, this here, this here, so that you are understanding your process differently. You were doing that actually when you were doing the man walking.
Yes.
That's what you were actually. I was struck by that.
Yes.
Because it was forward. You know, you were doing it in a, you know, as a straight line, not a straight line.
There's an undulating movement.
But you went the undulating afterwards. You realized that going on a straight line wasn't. But I meant a forward animation instead of going from the beginning to the middle and then the middle to the end. You know, doing a three-phase kind of. You went straight ahead. It was a straight ahead animation.
Yes, I didn't do. I didn't fill in the in betweens. Yes. Yes, because then I would have to be more scientific with my time.
Okay, that's
And there's that daring of taking the step and doing something from experience a little bit too. So it becomes a little bit like riding a bicycle and like breathing, or like being, you know, this is something that I am attracted to in this process. It basically goes against all the things I was supposed to know or learn, but at the same time, it's I just don't want to give up being there's an element of freedom that I don't want to give up.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that the imperfections that are bound with this are something that are understood and perceived in a positive way.